Here to talk about it this morning, Senator John McCain. Senator, you have been very critical all week of the president and the line he has taken. What exactly do you want him to do?
Well, I appreciate the statement that he made yesterday that was far stronger, and I think we need to continue to send that message. Bob, you and I are both students of history. In fact, we've had a chance to observe some history. But back on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers declared one universal principle that all of us are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And this is a human rights issue. This is an issue about whether people can freely demonstrate their disagreement with their government without being beaten and killed in the streets. And this is a long, long history of American advocacy and leadership for human rights. Now, I'm not for sending arms. I'm not for fomenting violence, nothing except to say that America's position in the world is one of moral leadership. And that's what America's all about. And frankly, it's not only what's about taking place in the streets of Tehran, but it's also what takes place in America's conscience.
Well, let me just ask you this, Senator. The president is obviously walking a very fine line here. If he takes a tougher line, he could run the risk of letting the Iranian government use that as an excuse to blame it on us, the great Satan, as they call us.
Well, first of all, the fine line is being dictated by the brutality in the streets of Tehran and the other cities in Iran. The United States hasn't done anything except to what we should do, and that is, as we did in the Congress on Friday, and that was a joint resolution, Congressman Berman and Pence in the House and Senator Lieberman and me in the Senate, again, reaffirming our conviction that people have the right to peacefully disagree with their government. And so here we are, again, having to be on the right side of history. We have to be on the right side of history. Well, now, every time that there's been a totalitarian or dictatorial government that has faced protests from their citizenry, they blame the United States. When the Prague Spring took place, there were many on the left in American politics. Don't encourage them. When the workers of Gdansk in Poland were fighting for their freedom, we shouldn't interfere. We did give them moral support. After the Berlin Wall came down, guess what? They said, you were the beacon of hope. One of the great honors of my life, and I'm sure yours, is to meet Nathan Sharansky. After the president's Axis Evil Empire speech, he said it spread like wildfire throughout the Gulag. There were those at that time that said, including the then Soviet Union, don't interfere in our affairs. America has the moral obligation. And again, that does not mean that we are for sending arms or anything else, although we certainly gave assistance to certain elements during the Cold War.
But let me ask you this. What if the president does really ramp up the rhetoric? What if he takes a much harder line, and then the Iranian government simply ignores it, the crackdown is brutal, people are killed? What does the United States do then?
Well, I think we're faced with the same dilemma that we were during the Cold War throughout centuries. If I could give you very briefly, Daniel Webster, one of the great senators in history, spoke about the Greek Revolution in 1823, and he said, when he was responding to people that said that mere rhetorical support would do no good, and I quote him, he said, I hope it may. It may give them courage and spirit. It may assure them of public regard, teach them that they're not wholly forgotten by the civilized world, and inspire them with constancy in the pursuit of their great end. And then he said, whether it helped or not, he said it was due to our character and called for by our own duty. Daniel Webster was right then. Ronald Reagan was right. Harry Truman was right. Scoop Jackson was right. Jack Kennedy was right when he said we'll go anywhere and bear any burden. The fact is that America has been and will be the beacon of hope and freedom. And we are not saying that the people who are now risking their lives, and some giving them in the streets in cities and towns in Iran, but we are saying we're on their side as they seek freedom.
What Senator Richard Lugar, ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, said this morning there could be a very brutal outcome to all of this. He thinks it's very dangerous what's happening. He also suggests, Senator, that President Obama or Secretary of State Clinton should sit down with their counterparts and talk about this in the Iranian government.
Well, first of all, we ought to decide which government to negotiate with. That certainly a lot of the Iranian people aren't exactly expressing confidence, the one that is in power now. But shouldn't we, before we decide when to sit down and what to talk about, see what happens in this train of events, which has surprised literally every expert that's taking place in Iran today? Yes, it is in our national security interest to negotiate Iranian nuclear acquisition or movement toward weapons and missiles to launch them. But is this the time to talk about that? Shouldn't we see how this whole thing plays out and spend our time giving our moral support?
Well, what are our options besides just giving moral support right now?
Actually, we don't have a lot. We didn't have a lot during the Cold War. And we may have made a mistake when we gave too much encouragement to the Hungarian Revolution. But during the Prague Spring and in Poland, still talk to Polish people today. They'll say, you were the beacon, you were the hope. And yet there were many who said, no, no, you will incite violence, there will be further repression. Bob, we've seen this movie before. And again, it's not so much about Iran, although it certainly is at the moment, but it's also about being on the right side of history. And I don't consider it meddling when you stand on the side of the principles that made our nation the greatest nation in history.
Speaking of history, there's a lot of history being made right now. The next thing that comes to mind overseas is North Korea.
Before we leave Iraq, could I just mention one thing very quickly? The workers in Gdansk and the Poles, we gave them printing presses, and that was a key element in doing so. You know what America, either intentionally or unintentionally, has given these young people? We've given them Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and they are communicating in an incredible fashion. It's unbelievable, the spread of information that's going on. And again, if I might say, I'm very proud that these are American technologies that they're using to such incredible effect. It's a wonderful thing to see.
All right.
Yep.
Point well taken. Let's talk about North Korea. What do you think the North Koreans are up to here? I mean, it seems like every time we make an overture to North Korea, nothing happens. It seems to get worse. Now we have, we're told, a North Korean vessel with a suspicious cargo headed out, U.S. ship, the USS John McCain, which is named for your father and your grandfather, is on patrol to intercept that ship, apparently. But what happens? The UN resolution says that they may try to stop that ship and ask permission to come aboard. But what happens if they don't give permission?
Well, that's a $64 question here, Bob. What happens if the ship doesn't give them permission to board? And any ship, North Korean ship, that has missiles or equipment or nuclear technology on board probably isn't going to give that permission. And I might add that in recent testimony last week before Congress, our leaders testified that there is North Korean and Iranian cooperation on nuclear weapons and proliferation. So the Security Council measure is a half measure. It's inadequate because right now apparently that ship may be going into a port at Myanmar, or if it went to any other unfriendly nation, then the course of action to be taken is to, quote, report it to the Security Council.
Should we report it anyway?
If we have hard evidence that that ship is carrying technology, equipment, missiles that are in gross violation of the UN Security Council resolutions, I think we should board it. It's going to contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to rogue nations that pose a direct threat to the United States. Now, I would like for the United States to go back to the Security Council, but most of all, I'd like for China to step in and do what is in China's interest, not to have a nuclear-armed aggressive Korea and a Japan, which will have to feel they have to be nuclear-armed, and other nations in the region. It is in China's interest. China is the country that really has the influence, and finally, as you know, seems to be some transition of power, which is always a very, very dangerous time where regimes of this sort are concerned.
And that brings us to part two of what's unfolding here, is that ship is making its way there. The North Koreans have suggested they may fire some missiles into the Pacific. The Secretary of Defense has put missile interceptors in Hawaii. He's put a ship out there to track it on radar. Do you really think the North Koreans might fire a missile at Hawaii?
I'm not sure they would fire directly at Hawaii. Predicting North Korean behavior is something that I'll predict a lot of things, but not that. But I think they might launch it into the area again, and it goes over Japan. How would we feel if a country such as North Korea were doing that over the United States? This is a very
So
dangerous
what do we need
business.
to do here? I mean, nothing we've done so far seems to slow them down at all.
Well, I'd love to tell you we will get more cooperation from the UN Security Council, but that's a bit too optimistic, to say the least. China has to understand that North Korea is a vital element in our relations, and it is in China's national interest. We're not asking for act of charity. They control their economy, they control a whole lot of things, and they're really the only nation that has influence. It should be a fundamental and vital aspect of our relations with China, and we should continue to work through the normal channels such as the UN. It's a very dangerous game that they're engaged in.
We're going to take a break here and come back and talk about all these other things that we need to talk about in a minute.